Great story, and it should tell people out there a story, not just this story, but the story that women's movement, women's getting their rights and affirmative action, can have a very positive effect on all of society, not just the targeted group, as it were. Moving along to another sort of topic, but very important, of course, to all Canadians, and I know to yourself, and then twigging into that a recent occurrence in the Senate. And we're going to talk a little bit about democratic reform, just a little bit about democratic reform, and then some of the statements that Senator Baker has been saying, and some of your views on that from where you sit, right in the Senate.
Well. There's all kinds of debate about whether or not we should have a reform Senate, whether it should be elected, whether it should be done in consultation with the provinces or despite the provincial objections and so on. And if we look at what happened in the United States 150 years ago, governors, their Senate was appointed when they started out by the state governors. And it started in the Pacific Northwest, and the state governor said, why should I do this? Why not have the people vote? And so all of a sudden that started to happen, and eventually democracy spread on Senate elections across the country. Now, there are a lot of people, and in particular a lot of elected members of the House of Commons, who don't want that, because if you had X number of senators elected province-wide here in Ontario with millions of votes presumably for each one, then that person would be a challenge, one, to the Premier, who runs in a specific riding, and two, to federal members of the House of Commons. So there's a lot of institutional resistance. But it seems to me the very fact of going through this exercise, in whatever final form it takes, is good for democracy. Because what we see now, and we just saw it with George Baker, who is a great Canadian, or was until something happened. Somebody joked and said maybe it was that hair dye soaking into George's brain. God love George. I don't know. Anyway, Danny Williams is down there, and Danny's got equalization money coming in, as they've had since they joined Confederation of 49, and he's got oil money coming in on the other side. The province of Ontario is a have-not province. We don't have enough money for our hospitals. We don't have enough money to do what we need to do. And, of course, billions of dollars are coming from Ontario, going to the so-called have-not provinces, most particularly Quebec, but Newfoundland getting over $1 billion a year as well. So why does George Baker feel alienated and isolated? The Liberals have all but one of the seats in the House of Commons and all but one or two of the seats in the Senate from Newfoundland. So with all that Liberal representation, why is he saying there should be a new party, a separatist Newfoundland party? And he says, look what the Bloc Québécois have done for Quebec. I mean, that'll come back in the next federal election with the Bloc Québécois saying the most senior Liberal, George has been on the Hill for 26 or 28 years, says we've done a good job for Quebec. And Michael Ignatieff's going to try and win seats in Quebec when the Bloc will be holding up George Baker's endorsement. So why does George Baker feel it necessary to do that, despite all of their representation, when he says, and despite the fact that the government of which you're a part is in a minority in the House of Commons? If the Liberals really did believe that this last budget, the Economic Action Plan, was unfair to Newfoundland, then defeat it, bring it down. But Michael Ignatieff won't do that because he doesn't believe that it's unfair to Newfoundland. And privately, I bet, he didn't tell me this, but privately I bet he thinks the Prime Minister's right to rein in these transfers because we're in a time of economic crisis and everybody has to tighten their belt. But why does George Baker feel it necessary to do this? Because somehow there isn't, in his view, a ventilation process that sufficiently meets the needs of the people. People are obviously upset in Newfoundland, and he thinks there should be another way. Well, I think one of the other ways would be to have a democratically elected Senate, because that would provide another avenue. It would be messy. There would be competing interests here, there, and everywhere. But if it allowed people to feel in a better way that their voices were being heard, even if they couldn't change the result, A lot of times it's just about getting it off your chest. So I think Senate reform is something that is going to become increasingly popular as people look at the tough decisions that have to be made, and some people will feel that their voices aren't heard. So let's provide another legitimate, because a lot of people say, well, the Senate's a bunch of appointed hacks, they're illegitimate. They are part of the Constitution. The Senate's part of the Constitution. The Senate has to pass legislation for it to become law. So we're there, and I must say, since going there, I've discovered they work a lot harder than a lot of us journalists, because we didn't really cover the Senate. We just sort of said, well, there'll be a rubber stamp and don't pay much attention. So the myth was out there that they never came to work, and some of them didn't. But basically what we've discovered in the last little, what I've discovered, is they work 3 12-hour days, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and they fly back to their regions on Friday and back again on Monday. So it's harder work. They work harder than most people think, and you have to be there, and they take attendance. It's like school.
Yeah.
When you walk in the door, when you go in the chamber, it's in the chamber. Not just I was in Ottawa and I thought about it. That you have to be there, and there's an official with a book that checks you off.
Well, I don't think many taxpayers would have a problem with that.
No, a lot of people go to work and punch a time clock.
Exactly.
So it's the same thing.
Thank you for mentioning about the relationship a senator has, where you began to talk about the relationship because the senator flies back to his or her region or province. Everyone understands the role of a member of Parliament. They know that when Parliament's sitting, they're in Ottawa, and then they come back home to the riding, and they meet constituents, and they listen to concerns, and contact government agencies that aren't reacting at least the right way, or maybe need a little bit of a push. Tell me, from your perspective, the work of a senator. What would a typical week be like, both from an Ottawa perspective, and then of course how you represent your constituents?
Very much the same as your week, Rick. We have committee meetings on the Hill. We have caucuses, Senate caucus, National caucus, regional caucus. We have people come from the riding, from PEI, my area, delegations. They want to present their plans. They have ideas for things. They have proposals, whatever. And so I meet them in my office, go to lunch with them, whatever is an available venue. Very often we're kind of like ping pong balls with going from one meeting to another and fitting somebody in for 10 or 15 minutes because they want you to know. I mean, I can take the documents and read them, and heaven knows lots of late nights and lots of on the plane or on the train reading what people have sent you and writing back notes and questions and emails. But there's nothing like the face-to-face, and so that goes on. And then when I go home to the island, it's the same thing. And I've got a staffer in PEI, and she sets up meetings. And so right from the time I get off the plane, we're meeting people, hearing their stories, trying to prevent, people have problems. The college wants to raise money. We have a list. Can you give us some advice on who we should call about this, that, or the other thing? Because they look at your broader experience to say, how can we bring your experience to bear on this particular problem? Sometimes it's just advice on what they should do to solve their own problem. So it's the whole range of things, immigration cases, all of that stuff, and people with projects or problems. Especially if you're on the government side, they feel that you have some special magic,
and they want you to advocate for it.
Yeah, and I do that just as you do.